On a warm Friday night in Pineview Heights, 2 gunshots split the quiet like a knife, and within minutes, 2 teenagers were gone, another boy was in handcuffs, and a working-class family's world began to collapse. The case would eventually span decades, but on that first chaotic night, 16-year-old Evan Miller was just a lanky kid from a crowded duplex, standing barefoot on a cracked driveway as blue lights washed over his face. His mother cried behind him, begging the officers to slow down, to listen, to look closer. But the patrol cars had already formed a tight circle, and rumors were spreading through the neighborhood faster than sirens. Everyone knew Evan. He was the middle child in a family of 7, a quiet kid who fixed bikes in the yard and helped his mom carry groceries from the bus stop. His father worked double shifts at a steel plant. His siblings shared hand-me-downs and arguments and laughter in a home that was loud but loving. That night, though, none of it mattered. A block away, 2 boys, Brandon Hale and Trevor Collins, both 17, had been gunned down in a drive-by attack. It was quick, brutal, and messy. A white sedan sped past, someone inside fired, and in seconds 2 families lost their sons. Police found no weapon, no fingerprints, and not a single trace linking Evan to the shooting. What they did find were a few shell casings on the pavement, and witnesses who thought they recognized the car. Or maybe they didn't. Their stories shifted. The colors changed. The distance grew. But the pressure to make an arrest was crushing. And Evan, who happened to be walking home around the same time, became the easiest name on the list. At the station, he was placed in a small, windowless room. It smelled of old coffee and metal furniture. Hours passed. Officers came and went. The fluorescent lights hummed. Evan asked for his mother. They told him she wasn't allowed in. He asked for a lawyer. They told him he didn't need one. He was 16. Detectives leaned in close, their voices low and relentless. "We know you did it. Your friends already told us the truth. You'll never go home unless you write it down." Evan cried until he couldn't breathe. He insisted he wasn't there. He insisted he didn't own a gun. He insisted he had nothing to do with what happened to Brandon and Trevor. But after 7 hours, tired, frightened, and alone, he picked up the pen. The confession was short, shaky, and filled with details fed to him by the detectives. His signature at the bottom was barely legible. Minutes later, he whispered the words he would repeat for the rest of his life. "I take it back. I didn't do this. Please. I didn't do this." But the damage was done. The next morning, the headline read, "TN confesses in double shooting." And in the span of a single night, Evan Miller went from a quiet 16-year-old with calloused hands and a bike repair hobby to the most hated name in town, a boy accused of murder, trapped in a system that had already made up its mind. Evan's written confession spread through Pineview Heights like wildfire. By Monday morning, neighbors whispered on porches, teachers exchanged uneasy glances, and classmates avoided eye contact with his younger siblings in the halls. The Millers had always been known as a hard-working, close-knit family, but now they lived under a shadow that seemed to grow darker with every passing hour. His mother, Linda Miller, refused to believe any of it. She marched to the station the moment visiting hours opened, demanding answers. "My son didn't do this," she told anyone who would listen. He was scared. He didn't understand what they were saying. But the detectives avoided her, brushing past with rehearsed lines about ongoing investigations. What no one told her was that Evan's interrogation had been recorded only partially, bits and pieces, not the whole 7 hours. And the portions captured on video showed a trembling teenager whispering agreement to their phrases, "Yes. I guess, if that's what happened, I don't know. I just want to go home." Not exactly the confident admission prosecutors wanted to present, but they had written words on paper, and for them, that was enough. Evan recanted immediately. He told the first public defender assigned to him that the confession was forced, that detectives yelled, threatened, promised he could go home if he signed. The attorney, buried under dozens of cases, nodded silently but offered little reassurance. "Recanting doesn't undo what's on the page," he finally said. "The district attorney thinks he has you." The prosecutor, Samuel Grady, was ambitious and eager to appear tough on crime. 2 teenagers were dead, and a confession from a third made the case neat, public-friendly, and easily packaged. Grady pushed for trial with astonishing speed. Meanwhile, evidence problems piled up. The casings found at the scene didn't match any firearm linked to Evan, because no firearm was ever found. No fingerprints placed him in the car described by early witnesses. No gunshot residue test was done on him the night of the shooting. Still, the state insisted they had their killer. But even that wasn't the truth. Witness accounts were falling apart. One teenager claimed she saw a white sedan. Another insisted it was silver. A third thought it might have been light blue. Distances shifted. Timelines blurred. Some weren't sure whether they saw Evan at all, or someone with the same hairstyle. Still, prosecutors clung to the confession. It was their anchor, their trump card. And they made sure the public believed it. "He told us what he did," Grady said at a press conference. "We have no reason to question his own words." Behind the scenes, Evan's family was unraveling. His father, Mark Miller, took extra shifts he didn't need, burying himself in work because the reality was too painful to face. His younger siblings drew pictures for him during their visits, sliding crayon-colored pages across the steel table. Evan tried to smile, but the weight of their fear pressed on his chest. The only person who refused to break was Linda. She attended every hearing, spoke with every volunteer group, contacted every innocence advocate she could find. And with her was Evan's cousin, Rachel Miller, a determined 21-year-old studying criminal justice, who treated Evan's case like a full-time mission. "This isn't over," Rachel whispered to Evan through the glass partition. "We're going to prove you didn't do this." But the system moved faster than they could gather help. At his first trial, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. Some believed the confession, others doubted everything else. A mistrial was declared, a fragile moment of hope. The prosecution immediately announced they would try him again. And as Evan was led back into holding, wrists bound, the weight of that decision settled on him like a final verdict. The fight was only beginning, and the odds were stacked against him. The second trial came fast, too fast for Evan's family, who were still scrambling for resources, letters, and any expert who might explain how a frightened teenager could be pushed into confessing to something he didn't do. But none of it mattered. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension, and the prosecution walked in confident, polished, and prepared. This time, they leaned even harder on the written statement. Prosecutor Samuel Grady held up the confession as if it were sacred text. He read each line slowly, dramatically, leaving long pauses as though expecting the jury to absorb guilt from the very ink on the page. The detectives who interrogated Evan took the stand, describing him as cooperative, truthful, and clear-minded, despite the 7-hour ordeal, the isolation, and the fact that he was barely 16. When the defense tried to question the tactics used in the interrogation, the prosecutor objected every time, and the judge sustained almost every objection. There was still no weapon, no forensic evidence, no eyewitness who could confidently point to Evan. But in Grady's hands, the confession became a story with a neat beginning and a devastating ending. A story the jury could repeat to themselves when they went to deliberate. Evan sat quietly beside his attorney, hands clenched, staring at the table. His mother watched him with trembling fingers pressed to her lips. His father stared straight ahead, motionless. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman rose. The judge asked the question. The answer came with a finality that shattered the room. Guilty. Linda wept into her hands. Evan felt the world tilt. His legs went numb, and his ears filled with a low, rushing sound, as though his entire life were collapsing inward. He was sentenced to life without parole. 16 years old, and the judge's words ensured he would never walk free. Prison became a different kind of world, harsh, loud, unpredictable. Evan had to grow up fast. He learned to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to keep his head down. Still, violence found him more than once. He spent long stretches in isolation, staring at concrete walls while time dissolved into an endless blur. Yet life didn't stop for him. Against all odds, he became a father at 19 when his girlfriend from before the arrest gave birth to a baby girl. He held her only once, during a brief, heavily supervised visit, her tiny hand curled around his finger before the guards signaled their time was up. That moment became a memory he clung to, a reminder that part of him still existed beyond prison gates. Throughout those years, Linda and Rachel never stopped fighting. Rachel visited law libraries, wrote letters to attorneys, reached out to innocence organizations, and tracked down anyone who had been present the night of the shooting. Her determination hardened into something powerful, a driving force that kept Evan's case alive even when every door seemed permanently shut. Then, slowly, the cracks in the conviction began to show. A witness came forward saying he had been pressured by investigators to identify Evan. Another admitted he never actually saw the shooter's face. A third claimed detectives dismissed someone else's name, someone tied to a local group known for feuds in the neighborhood. The puzzle pieces were shifting. And in the background, a rumor began to spread, a whisper that the confession at the heart of the case wasn't just unreliable. It was coerced. The idea lingered like smoke, building momentum, waiting for the moment when everything would finally ignite. By the time Evan reached his mid-20s, he had spent nearly a decade behind the same walls he'd entered as a terrified teenager. His voice had deepened, his shoulders had broadened, and the softness in his face had hardened into something quieter, a kind of exhausted resilience. But the spark in his eyes remained, fueled entirely by the two women who refused to let the world forget him, his mother Linda, and his cousin Rachel. Their persistence began to pay off. One summer afternoon, Rachel received a call from a man who had overheard her asking questions around the neighborhood years earlier. He didn't want to give his name over the phone. His voice shook. But he said something that made her freeze. "I wasn't honest back then, about what I saw." The man agreed to meet in a diner outside town. When he slid into the booth across from her, he kept his cap low, hands trembling around a cup of coffee. He paused several times before speaking, swallowing hard each time. He hadn't seen Evan at the scene, he said. In fact, he'd seen a different car, and he believed the shooter was someone entirely separate, a boy involved in a known neighborhood feud. When he tried to tell detectives this back then, they told him he must be confused. Rachel felt her pulse hammering. This was more than hearsay, it was a witness recantation. Within weeks, a second witness came forward. Then a third. Each said some version of the same thing. Detectives had pressured them, corrected their memories, or implied that Evan was already proven guilty. One young man admitted he had been told he could be charged himself if he didn't help the case. The fragile truth was beginning to surface, the confession had shaped the investigation, not the other way around. Meanwhile, in prison, Evan's life took another turn. He met Sarah Bennett, a quiet woman who belonged to a volunteer prison ministry. They grew close during group meetings and later through letters. Their conversations were slow and gentle, built on trust rather than fear. When she asked him once, "Do you still believe you'll get out someday?" he answered, "I have to. If I stop believing, they win." Sarah eventually became his fiancée, standing beside Linda and Rachel in the long fight for justice. Then, in the 11th year of Evan's sentence, everything changed. A judge agreed to review the case after noticing inconsistencies in the confession and the newly gathered recantations. For the first time, the interrogation methods were placed under a microscope. An expert in coerced confessions testified that Evan's age, isolation, and fear made him extremely vulnerable. The hours-long questioning, the promises, the pressure, all of it fit the textbook pattern of a false admission. One moment became the turning point. A detective took the stand and claimed, confidently, that Evan had volunteered details only the shooter would know. The defense presented evidence showing those details had been fed to him during the interrogation. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The judge leaned back, removed his glasses, and sighed, a long, heavy exhale that echoed through the room. After a brief recess, he returned with a ruling that sent ripples through the county. The confession was coerced. The conviction was overturned. Linda collapsed into tears, holding on to Rachel, both shaking with relief. Sarah covered her mouth, whispering, "It's happening, it's finally happening." The prosecution tried to stall, trying to argue for a delay. But the judge was firm. Evan was granted release on bond while the state decided whether to retry him. When he walked out of the prison gates that evening, the sky was streaked pink and gold. Linda wrapped her arms around him, sobbing his name, and for the first time in 12 years, Evan breathed air that didn't belong to a cell. He hugged his daughter, now a preteen, and she whispered, "I knew you didn't do it." He married Sarah shortly after, and they welcomed 2 more children into the world. For a brief moment, life felt whole again. But the story wasn't over. The state announced they would pursue a 3rd trial. And Evan, who wanted only peace, was thrust back into another battle, one that would determine whether he got to keep his new life, or lose everything all over again. Evan's release felt miraculous, but freedom came with a clock ticking over his head. The district attorney's office, embarrassed, defensive, and unwilling to admit a mistake, announced they intended to try him a 3rd time. For Evan, it felt like stepping out of one cage only to see another waiting down the road. Still, he built what life he could while the legal machinery slowly churned. He found part-time work with a construction crew willing to overlook his record. He drove his kids to school, helped with homework, and tried to relearn simple things he'd missed: texting, online banking, how to use a smartphone without staring at it like it was magic. Sarah stayed beside him through everything. Their little house was modest and cluttered with toys, but to Evan it felt like a palace, a place where laughter erased the echoes of prison doors. At night, when the children were asleep, he would sit at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching Sarah cook or hum to herself. Sometimes he whispered, "I still can't believe I'm here." She always answered, "You deserve this life, Evan." But even as he embraced fatherhood and marriage, his future hung in limbo. A 3rd trial meant everything he'd rebuilt could be stripped away. Meanwhile, the case continued to unravel. Rachel worked tirelessly with the defense team. More witnesses recanted. Some admitted detectives implied they could help themselves if they blamed Evan. Others revealed they were teenagers at the time, scared, confused, and eager to agree with authority. Even one of the surviving victims' relatives stepped forward, saying he never believed Evan's confession made sense. It didn't match the details. It didn't match the car. It didn't match anything, he said in a sworn statement. And then came the piece of evidence that shook the entire foundation of the case, a previously overlooked tip linking another group of teens, known for tension and conflicts in the neighborhood, to a white sedan matching the early descriptions. They had been questioned briefly years ago, and then inexplicably released. The defense argued this was the lead investigators should have pursued from the beginning. Instead, they locked in on Evan the moment he signed the paper. The courtroom during pre-trial hearings became a battleground. The prosecutor, now a different attorney replacing the long-gone Samuel Grady, tried to salvage what remained of the case, but momentum had shifted. Reporters filled the wooden benches. Public interest grew. And every new revelation made the original conviction look more like a tragedy than a triumph. Through it all, Evan remained steady. He attended every hearing in a pressed shirt, sometimes holding Sarah's hand, sometimes clutching his mother's. He answered questions politely, greeted supporters, and tried to shield his children from news crews camped outside the courthouse. But privately, the pressure was crushing. One afternoon, the prosecution offered him a deal, not freedom exactly, but a safety net. If he pled guilty to a lesser charge, he would receive time served. He would never return to prison. He could go home immediately. But he would forever be marked as a convicted killer. Evan sat in a small conference room with his attorney, Sarah, Linda, and Rachel. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Evan exhaled slowly. "I won't do it," he said. "I won't tell my kids their father is guilty of something he didn't do. Not again. Not ever." Linda covered her face, tears slipping through her fingers. Rachel nodded with fierce pride. Sarah reached for Evan's hand and whispered, "Then we go forward. All the way." With that, the deal collapsed, and the case moved toward a full jury trial. The decision sent waves through the community. Some called him brave. Others called him reckless. But everyone knew the stakes: if the jury convicted him again, Evan would return to prison for life. As the courthouse prepared for jury selection, Evan lay awake night after night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of the family he might lose. One thought haunted him most. He had survived wrongful imprisonment once. He wasn't sure he could survive it again. The third trial began on a crisp autumn morning, the courthouse steps crowded with reporters, supporters, and onlookers drawn in by more than a decade of questions. For Evan, walking through those doors felt like stepping into the same nightmare he'd barely escaped. But this time, he wasn't a boy alone in an interrogation room. He had a team, a family, and the truth on his side. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but different from the past. There was no dramatic reading of a confession, the judge had already ruled it inadmissible. Jurors wouldn't see the frightened 16-year-old version of Evan or read the words detectives coached him to write. Instead, they would hear the case as it truly stood, a crime with no physical evidence tying Evan to it, no weapon, no matching car, and a wave of recanted testimony casting doubt on everything prosecutors once claimed was solid. The new prosecutor tried to rebuild the old theory, but it came across thin, a puzzle missing its centerpiece. Witnesses took the stand and admitted they had been confused, scared, or pressured all those years ago. One stated openly, "They told me if I didn't say I saw Evan, I'd get in trouble." Another said he insisted the car wasn't Evan's, but detectives told him he remembered wrong. On the defense side, experts spoke clearly and methodically about coerced confessions, especially among young teens. They explained how exhaustion, fear, and authority can twist memory, and how children often say what adults want to hear when they believe it will end the ordeal. Evan watched the jurors listening, leaning in, taking notes. For the first time, he felt the possibility of being understood. But the trial was still brutal. Evan had to relive details he'd avoided for years. He listened to descriptions of the crime, saw photos he wished he could forget, and endured prosecutors questioning his honesty despite everything that had come to light. And then, after 2 weeks of testimony, it was time for closing arguments. The defense painted the picture the jury already sensed: a frightened teenager pushed until his will collapsed, a community desperate for answers, and investigators who shaped the case around a confession instead of shaping the confession around the evidence. The prosecution insisted the original story remained plausible, but even their tone suggested they no longer believed in the strength of their own case. When the jury went to deliberate, Evan sat on a bench outside the courtroom, Sarah's hand in his mother and cousin beside him. Hours stretched. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, whispering, "No matter what happens, you're not alone." Linda prayed quietly. Rachel stared at the clock as if willing it to move faster. Finally, a bailiff appeared. "They have a verdict." Evan's heartbeat thundered in his ears as they all filed inside. The jury entered, 12 people carrying the weight of his entire life. The foreperson stood. The judge asked the question. On the charge of murder, we find the defendant not guilty. For a moment, the world froze. Evan didn't breathe. Didn't blink. It was only when Sarah collapsed into tears beside him, and his mother released a sob that echoed across the room, that the reality finally broke through. Evan covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking, overwhelmed by relief so powerful it left him lightheaded. He was free. Truly free. Not because someone cut him a deal. Not because of a mistake in paperwork. But because the truth finally surfaced. The days that followed felt unreal. He stepped outside without fear. He tucked his children into bed without a ticking clock behind him. He went out to dinner with his family and caught himself marveling at the simple sight of a street at night, lights, laughter, the hum of life he'd missed for so long. But freedom didn't erase everything. The years he lost weighed heavily. He struggled with distrust, with sudden flashes of panic, with the strange emptiness that comes after surviving something enormous. Still, he pushed forward. He began speaking publicly about wrongful convictions, about the dangers of forced confessions, and about the countless others who remained behind bars with stories like his but no Rachel or Linda to fight for them. He filed a civil rights lawsuit against the original investigators and the county, determined not out of revenge but out of necessity, a way to hold the system accountable so no one else's life would be shattered the way his had been. Yet even after his exoneration, the shadows of his past sometimes resurfaced. Months later, he faced a new accusation, a heated domestic dispute in which police arrested him simply because of his history. It was painful, humiliating, and frightening. But this time, the truth didn't take years to prove. At trial, he was acquitted swiftly. The incident became another reminder of how deeply a wrongful conviction can stain someone's life, even long after it's overturned. In the end, Evan refused to let any of it define him. He continued raising his children, working steadily, and speaking out whenever he could. He found strength in the ordinary, morning routines, school events, weekend breakfasts. He learned to enjoy the future without constantly glancing back at the past. His story was not one of perfection or triumph without scars. It was the story of a boy swallowed by a broken system, a man rebuilt through faith and perseverance, and a family that refused to let injustice have the last word. And so, after years stolen, battles fought, and truth reclaimed, Evan Miller walks forward, not untouched by the past, but unbroken, proving that even in the darkest corners of the justice system, the light of persistence can lead a wronged man home.